Hello and welcome to The Person of the Therapist. I'm Dee Preston Dillon. I'm delighted to welcome Roberta Rook today as we walk into some of the power of the existential, the importance of mortality, and Roberta's deep work in this field over many years. So, Roberta, welcome. Let's begin with how do you anchor your professional status, your licensure, your theoretical leaning? Let's begin right there.
Um, so I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor, LCPC, and it's been a long journey through many permutations, I guess, or iterations of what I've done over the years and what has contributed or landed me here. I've been a bereavement counselor and program coordinator for Chesapeake Life Center, which is the bereavement department of Hospice of the Chesapeake, for the past 23 years now. I have to think about that. And as being part of a bereavement department, we're both of hospice and also separate in the sense that we see people from the community at large. And that's something that hospices generally and governing bodies of hospices want us to do. They want us to see people in the community at large who've had a death-related loss. So there may be other people from other sources who call us and want counseling around a loss they've experienced through death. So we also deal with traumatic losses or sudden losses, I think is a more accurate way to put it, as well as the more expected deaths that occur through illness and hospice care. So, and the majority of the people we see are through hospice care or hospice bereaved. And every hospice is different in terms of what they offer in the bereavement end of things, because we have a little more latitude about what is offered. Some places offer and I think that's also a perception that the public has, that hospice is like one thing, but it could be many different hospices, and they may offer different programs with bereavement. So we have a pretty robust counseling center. We offer a wide variety of activities, workshops, as well as individual counseling. And our individual counseling for our hospice families consists of 10 gratis or free sessions over the 13-month period post-loss. If they want to go beyond that, and we work that out in counseling, if there's a need and a desire to do that, then we work on a sliding fee scale. Then we also work on a sliding fee scale with our community members. And it's a very reasonable sliding fee scale, let me just say that. So it's very affordable counseling. So that's what we kind of do as an organization. I feel that the really strong thing about working in the department I've worked in is that we are allowed to be creative with our offerings. We are allowed to, we're invited, our feedback about things that we're interested in. I'm thinking specifically in my case of nature-informed groups for grief. And so you can be interested in something and have a connection to that and devise group around that. So we really have a lot of latitude to be creative. And so that's the organization right now that I've been with for a long time, gotten to know the organization pretty well. So my theoretical journey, wow. that
Oh,
is,
let's pause right there
yeah,
for a moment.
yeah,
Because I'd just like to take a moment to dig in, because you do supervision, you do
yes,
training,
hmm,
workshops,
yes,
and groups, and then
hmm,
the creative end, which is this, nature supported journey through bereavement. And so when you're allowed to do fortunately, some very creative things, how do you approach? Like, I'm imagining you have some individuals, some couples that may have lost a child. You may have entire families, or even community groups.
hmm.
Then do you like they come to you and then you work together to collaborate in terms of what would meet their needs?
It's a great question. For our hospice bereaved, we have a follow-up protocol with all our identified primary caregivers in a family. So it's usually one primary person who gets at various points throughout the first year after their loss, they get information about our programs. They get contacted through a call, they get mailings. And so they have already received a lot of information
Hmm.
from the admission process on through the death of their loved one prior to coming to our side of things
Yeah.
about what support is there. Now, do people typically remember a lot of that? No.
Hmm.
So it's important that when the death occurs, they again get information. This is available to you. We will call you to check in. We will send you
Hmm.
literature. We will reach out. And if you would like counseling, you can call us at this number. And so they find us that way. Uh,
Hmm.
Sometimes what happens with more community-based losses is
In
an
a school setting,
yeah,
I
right. So right. And we've got a group going on right now that they were able to introduce to the Anne Arundel school system that is a protocol that was grant funded. I'm not doing it, but my colleagues are in there. It's really exciting because public schools generally don't let a lot of outside counselors in. They have in-house programs. They prefer you to come and teach their people
sure.
how to do things. But the school has let my colleagues in to do this. And so this is really exciting. This is
Mm.
a counseling protocol for children. So, however, non-public schools or private schools often don't have that infrastructure. So there may be an incident. We haven't gotten a call in a while about this, but we have gotten calls in the past about there has been a death of a teacher
Mm.
or a student. We are not a crisis
Mhm.
center, so, but we also have a relationship in Anne Arundel County, we're in 4 different counties, with the crisis response team, that they have a memorandum of understanding that they will approve a certain number of counseling sessions for people that avail of their services who've had a death.
Mm.
So
Mm.
we have that relationship. And so there's the schools. I've
Mhm.
been called in with things like coworker loss. It could be something like a suicide of a coworker, an accidental death of a coworker, and they would contact us about those things. So it's important that we have community connectivity so that people know we're here and
Yeah.
people know they can reach out to us if they have this need for their community.
Mhm.
So those are some of the things we've done. We do family counseling. So a lot of our counseling with grievers is often, it can be adult families, could
Mhm.
be a couple, could be siblings, could be
Mhm.
parent, and adult child is not an uncommon dynamic as well. We see children and we see their parents or their carers or whoever their parental figures are. And so it's across the lifespan and that we work with people. And so I think our those that work with us as interns get good experience working with people across the lifespan with grief and loss.
Two things occur to me that this is um, probably nationwide, some version in every state and counties across the
Mhm.
nation. I'm hoping that's the case. And also, I think it's important to underscore that this is very specialized training that counselors or social workers or psychologists, marriage and family, the whole mental health field doesn't get this kind of specialized training and perspective and methods in graduate studies or even afterwards, unless the individual therapist like yourself really steps into that and reads the literature, gets the methodologies.
Yes, and when our interns come on board, I try to give them sort of a crash course in grief and loss because some schools have classes on grief and loss. Others, my Hopkins interns I most recently had, they don't have a class on that. I would hope that all the schools would eventually offer classes, at least one foundational class on bereavement. And having said that, back in 1999, and this will weave back into my story a bit. I took a postgraduate certification program, 3 graduate credits, or was it 9? It was 3 classes, so I guess it was 9. In the field of thanatology, and a lot of people don't know what is thanatology anyway. Well, if you think of the root thanatos, which is death, it's interesting. We even have I think a comic book character right now called Thanos. And so our archetypal stuff all over the place. But anyway, yeah, so when I took those classes at Hood College, which has an excellent program in it, in 1999, postgraduate, there were very few schools that were offering thanatology certificates and advanced study. Now I haven't looked lately on how many there might be, but I know it's expanded. And I'm really heartened to know that because, as you said, it isn't something that, and having said that, that's specialized training you would have to pursue as
Right.
a clinician. So it's not necessarily foundational to the
Yeah.
training the school offers. And
Mhm.
I have heard therapists say, well, yeah, I know about grief and loss, but one point I'm going to make later kind of shows me they're not
Right.
quite up to speed with it.
How could they?
So,
How could they be? That would be
right.
like, yeah. Within our field, there's so much specialization. Um, let's do circle back. I have so many questions that I'd like us to cover, but I would like to take a moment to circle back to as we look at the person of the therapist and your reflections on where you came from and maybe how your own developmental experiences brought you to who you are.
Well, it's interesting because there are going to be, I think, 2 major pieces to this. I won't go into my whole life history. However, and I didn't understand this until much later, what really brought me to psychology as a field.
Hmm.
So that would be my sort of young adult
Hmm.
piece.
Hmm.
I think when I was in high school, I thought, oh, psychology is so interesting because you get to know. I liked the idea. It was maybe a little less about helping, and I like to know about what made people tick.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
still enjoy that. One of my favorite books when I this sounds strange, but one of my favorite books when I was in college was a book on psychopathology.
Uh-huh.
And it just had all these fascinating stories, like of Lee Harvey Oswald and
Hmm.
how did these people develop into what happened with them. And
Yeah.
I found it fascinating. I think I didn't realize at the time, at that point in my life, how much the caregiver was in the background, the person who wanted to help. And it was only many years later that I was able to connect the dots, because years later, a therapist asked me, "Have you ever been parentalized?" And I said, "No, no. My mom was really a great mom." I thought of people as being parentalized as they had to take care of their siblings and change diapers and run a household and those kinds of things. So I thought about it and I said, well, and this was after not long after my mother had died. I said, well, wait a minute. I think I have, because what I did hold for my mother was all of her grief and her sorrow over the relationship with my father that was very, very fraught. She left him when I was 5 years old. The relationship had a lot of abusive elements. My mother and I was thinking today, how old was I when she first started talking about this to me? I guess they wouldn't have called it in those days middle school, but Catholic school was like grade 1 to 8. But she started talking to me sometime around the ages about um, my father's, not going some detail, but then she'd hold back and say, well, you don't know the half of it. And I knew later what more of it was, because I got more of it from her friends. And the now we're talking about the 19, I don't know, it was 10, like the early 1970s. My mom was a Catholic convert. She got a lot of help. She worked for the Catholic Church. And I know what they said about Catholic priests, but the Catholic priest she worked with, her group of priests, was extremely supportive. And this was an era when priests often told abused women, just, hey, stick it out, deal with it. But they weren't doing that, and they were really supportive of her, which my father later very much misinterpreted. And so anyway, she was in this horrible place. She never got therapy for it. And I often thought, my mom needed therapy so badly. But so who was the therapist? Well, I wasn't doing, this is the thing that all new therapists say. I wasn't doing anything except listening. I was holding it, and I didn't know. My mom would cry. She would be angry. She would be, years later, she was able to let go of a lot of the stuff, but this didn't happen for a long time. So I was sort of in that holding space, but also feeling sort of a lack of agency, a helplessness. I'm like, how do I help her? I don't know. I just sit there and listen. And then, so I think I really didn't put those two and two together with that piece of it, that was informing a lot of my pull towards working with people in a therapeutic setting. So there was that wound. And, a lot of times we don't realize what the essential primal wound is until a lot later. So that started me on that track. And so that was this one piece of my life.
And
And then
very organic, a very,
yeah,
very um, presence to the little deaths, the death
yes,
of suffering, the death of abuse, the emotional, physical, everything that is tremendous loss and trauma and all that you were witness from very early then.
yeah.
So yeah, let me please continue.
Yes, and all the while, my mother struggled with me continuing she encouraged a relationship with my father, which I had, but it was always really, really difficult. And I understand children of split relationships. I think I empathize with them really well because you're walking this line all the time, especially if there's a lot of animosity in the relationship. And which there was. So there was this piece of me in my early development that I think was about that. And this vague sense, yeah, I want to be a counselor. And at the time, I really first was getting into some of the work I was doing was sort of entry level. I was doing things like I worked with the developmentally disabled for a brief stint. I worked as a rehabilitation counselor for people with chronic mental illness, and all this work was really important. I worked in a clinic, but I think the next seismic piece of my life was when I was 35. My father died first, and that was an expected death. And my father was much older than my mother. And he died with COPD. And as I said, expected death. And he had hospice care. Um, and so that was that. And I was like, okay, well, I'll make peace with that. And 34 days later, my mother she had moved back down to her hometown in Virginia and lived there for, I don't know how many years, probably 15 years before this happened. Retired, was really happy there. I think was in a good place. And then she was basically hit by a truck, pickup truck. And she was walking, people walked, on the road outside in the rural area. And she was airlifted to a hospital in Norfolk, which is the nearest major civilization to that area. And she died as a result of the accident. Not right away, but she died. And so that was like it's like you're a snow globe and somebody just goes shake it up and try to figure out what is going to happen when all the flakes settle down. So that was seismic, and it affected my life. And then it affected, of course, I was a counselor. So what do I think as a counselor once I've gotten through to some amount of healing? Well, the first thing I think of as a counselor is, well, I've got to try to facilitate healing for others through grief. And so because that's what we do as counselors, a lot of times we think, well, how can I help other people to get through this wound I have? And so it was very much a passion, but I wanted to make sure I had healed some healing behind me before I dove in. And because I had the ability to stop my job at the time, I could stop, and then I took the advanced classes in thanatology. I was able to take about 2 years off to go to school. I was really lucky. And then well, eventually get a job at a bereavement job after I'd worked in a clinic to get some clinical hours. So that, and when I think of my life, and that's why Jessica's commentary was really about her life was interesting, about all the loss. And when she looked back on it, it was all these things that were losses that informed her journey.
Jesse Fairchild.
Yes. Yeah,
Jesse. That video.
I want to say Jessica. And I thought, my goodness, wow, I'm resonating with this because I met my husband because of a traumatic loss. He was in a terrible accident. So many points in my life, and I got the job at Hospice of the Chesapeake because of 9/11, because our counselor we had just started our program in this county, in Prince George's County, our counselor had just started. It was August and September. She was in she was in the Air Force Reserves. She was called up and she was away for this like indefinite period of time, and they needed somebody. And I was just like, well, we don't know if we can really hire you permanently yet, and it's part-time and it's in Landover. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I live in Baltimore. How am I going to get to Landover? It was like the other side of the world, but now it's not. And so all these things seem to coalesce. And I do believe in synchronicities, and that we're being whatever is guiding us, um, and and showing the path. We can choose the path or not, but I think, certainly when you're being sort of bonked over the head with it, saying, "Hey, this is it. This is your path." And it's like,
So
wow,
it,
okay.
it it's an intense it sounds a continuous
Yes.
reawakening, and that draw that resonates with you at the same time, a healing process for you, like stepping into that, being available, and bringing your own sensibilities about loss and
Yeah.
grief, and to be able to resonate. I'd like to ask what techniques, and I don't like using that word, what methods or what approaches have you found really helpful working with grieving families, and those extended families, but mostly the clients who come to you? What do you do? How would you say your approach differs from traditional social work or counseling or psychology,
Hmm.
without going into a lot of song and dance about theory? But um, how would you describe what you do and how you do it?
Great question. So now that I've been doing this work for 23 years, much of my theoretical base has been informed by grief theories. And I would say the things that have been really impactful for me, and the work I have done with expressive techniques, such as you've been a wonderful mentor with sand work, and with things like with SoulCollage, which is a technique of collage where you basically are making a wisdom deck of your own lived parts and experiences. It really is parts work, even though they weren't, when it was developed, they weren't really talking about that as such. And also, I also know another technique called the Mari. I haven't had a chance to use it as much lately because it is a fairly lengthy, it involves the use of color and symbol to illustrate developmental pieces in a person's patterning. I love stuff like that. And I have been able to use it with some of my clients. It's just that with the constraints of, yes, medical record keeping, things like that, I have to, it's a long kind of interpretation of the initial interview I do with people. But I really have enjoyed working with that. And I've worked with SoulCollage with individuals and groups, adults and children. I've worked, oh my gosh, the sand has saved me with children because I'm not a specialist with children, but children really take to sand. And I just, and so many things come out of it that are really, really interesting. And when my adults are amenable, I try to encourage them to maybe dip their toe into an expressive thing. It really is okay. They come into the office, and since my office is like a one-stop shop here, it's like they see the stuff on the shelves and they go, "Whoa, do you collect Disney figures?" And that's what the grown-ups say. And so I'm like, well, yeah, but not exactly maybe what you think. And so So I found those things to be really helpful. And in terms of grief, theories specific to grief, I would say there's a theory called the dual process model, which helps us to understand that there's a side to grief that's about acute feeling, and there's a side to grief that's about needing to shake it off and find a distraction so that we can get through our day or think about the future. And there's no integrated theory of grief that I can never pronounce their names, but Strobe and Schut, who developed the dual process model, have integrated aspects of attachment theory into that. So that's been the biggest integration, I think. Robert Niemeyer's work on meaning and
Wow.
constructivism, really powerful, because I do so much with people around meaning making. Because once they get through the really acute grief, they really need to look at what's my life about. And that's one thing I love about this work. Another person that's had a huge influence on me, well, of course, Carl Jung, but I never knew. When I was younger, it wasn't like, oh, Carl Jung,
Mm.
wow, he's really cool. As I got older, Carl Jung became so much more important and present in what I
Mhm.
do. And I think part of that is because knowing the work of Carol Pearson with
Mhm.
archetypes,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
use archetype work with people, and it's really interesting and fascinating and really helps them to get an idea of
Yeah.
direction and patterning in their lives. So
Well,
that's,
let me
yeah.
just for a moment here to remind all of us that there are therapies that are built and designed for behavior change. And I think publicly it gets very confusing that there are therapies that specialize not in behavior change, but in working with trauma, very specific, good, solid research, and grief and loss, death and dying. This is such an important existential, very ground of being, meaning, um, and also bringing in that attachment, so powerful that that's very different. And so therapists it's not everyday therapists that have this kind of grounding, that have an understanding and the methodologies. And so I'd want to encourage anybody who happens to be viewing to locate if their search is for support, for bereavement, for grief, for their losses or family losses, then to find those that have dedicated their lives to this focus, to this way of being present, this way of finding meaning and validating. Um, so I just wanted to put that little bracketed bit there to that way too often, even therapists, let alone the general public, get confused about any therapist will do. And this is a specialized area. But I truly do not believe that that's true. But I didn't want to, I just wanted to
Thank
pause
you.
us for a moment there and also applaud the variety of deep special approaches that what you're doing, like your colleagues who are so steeped in this, is not play as someone might perceive that as a waste of time or what is this about archetypes and silly meaning. Instead, it stops all the noise of life and goes directly down to who are you, how many days we have together,
Mhm.
and how do we walk forward after along with our losses and allowing individual time and process to process those with dignity. So yeah, so where does that bring us right now with you and who
Yeah.
you are, Roberta?
Well, boy, that's a big question. Um, this is, I remember asking my grief counselor many years ago, that I had through Gilchrist. Um, I was coming to the end of the counseling with her, and I said, well, I'm a counselor. What do you think if eventually, not right now, I trained to become a grief counselor? And she said, oh, that would be great. And she said, because I remember what she said, the the transference is so positive. And I thought, that's it, because people come to us, something happened to them. It's not because they're dysfunctional, they're damaged, there's some kind of pathology.
Right.
It's because they've been on life's journey and they've experienced the loss. And yes, the whole person walks into the room, all the things that have happened in their life,
Mm.
it comes in with them. However, I think what bereavement counseling does, and I work in a county where a lot of people do resist, or they find other means to access support, primarily the church. And that's not casting any aspersion on the church. And they still may have a stigma about getting counseling. So a lot of the people I see, the first time they've ever had counseling is to come to bereavement counseling, because it's not as intimidating.
Mm.
It's like, wow, well, my mom died or my husband died, and I need some support. And so I think it's a really great way to help people get in the door with
Mhm.
working with a counselor or a therapist. And also because when you've had a major grief in your life, you are so opened up. You are ready for a lot of really transformative processes. And you are questioning your entire way of being many times. Like, how have I been with my friends? Maybe I was the person who was always quote unquote strong, and now I can't count on them because they don't know how to interact with me. This has been not reciprocal. Or I think of another theorist, John Schneider, and he says it's called the transformative model of grief, and he says that, unfortunately he died, but he says in grief work we ask three questions, and we might not ask these literally, but three questions are considered. What is lost? And that's who is lost, but also what was lost along with them. Um, what remains, and what is possible.
Mm.
And I really think that encapsulates this work is transpersonal to me. It's not, yes, do I use CBT and reframing? Sure, when people need to stop judging themselves about how
Mhm.
they're grieving and their
Mhm.
expectations and how long this should take, and
Yeah.
um, their judgments that they make about their feelings and their thoughts about their feelings, and I shouldn't feel this. Sure, yes, we do that. And there's a place for that.
Mhm.
But for me, CBT isn't it's a way of intervening, but it's not a way of seeing
Mhm.
with them
Mm.
as much.
Yes.
So yeah, I do it. And there's a certainly a time and a place for
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah,
Mm.
we were talking yesterday in our group supervision meeting about why it's so hard to tell other people what you do for a living, because they look at, if you say grief before the word therapist or counselor, people will either go, oh, or they'll go, wow, you must be
Mhm.
really spiritual. And so
Yeah.
it's sort of our, but they don't realize the incredible things we see within, and the incredible shifts and changes we can see even in this short period of
Mm.
time with clients, because they're so open to everything. The grief has opened them up.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Roberta, um, you brought two two symbols that represent some aspect of qualities that you appreciate in your work or in yourself on this journey. Let's take a moment and turn our focus to you. What did you bring? If you would hold each one up and describe its why you selected that, how it may be a bridge, a connection between the depth of grief work that you do in you, who you are.
Yes. So there are two things from, I guess they're from my like two favorite things to do with people in the world, which is sand and soul collage.
Okay.
So the first one is a soul collage card, and I'm going to try to hold it so it can be seen.
That's nice and
Yes.
clear.
Is it clear? Okay. Because
A
it is a
little
somewhat dark card. And if it,
um
a little more like that.
um and I see the white owl, and behind it
Yes.
looks like persons.
Yes. A couple of men, and they're sort of struggling. It reminds me of, it's like a ship that's going down. Um, Soul collage, as I said before, is a way of exploring our parts and also the things that are archetypal, that are our parts, but also beyond us.
Mm,
Um, this card is a part of me, and it's also an archetypal element to it. So with Soul Collage, we do a journaling piece, and then and the journaling piece we do is we speak from the card in the first person.
mhm,
So the card becomes our sort of our container and our release too. Our we have the catharsis through putting the
mm.
imagery. And people always say, well, what is it? It's like, well, it's magazine images. So anyway, so one of my favorite symbolic animals is not just any owl, the barn owl. And I think it might go back to when I was, I don't know, 5 or 6, and I used to draw a lot. And there was the poem, The Owl and the Pussycat.
Oh, yes.
And the book I had a picture of illustration of the barn owl. And I remember thinking, that owl has a face like a heart. And
Mm,
I just was I couldn't believe as a kid an animal could have a face like a heart.
mhm,
And so that always struck me.
mm.
It's a beautiful and haunting face,
Yes.
and they're a beautiful and haunting creature to me.
Mhm.
So what the name of this card, and I created this card, I don't know, it just somehow, when I thought about coming today, I thought, this is the card I have to take out.
Mhm.
And I've got a lot of cards, but this is the one that spoke to me. So the name of this card is Of the Night But Light. And I'll
Of
read,
the night,
but
but
light.
light.
Yes.
Mhm,
Yes. And
mm,
so when I speak from it in the first person, and I have it's just a brief journaling. So it says, I am the one who helps you see and hear through the struggle and darkness. I am of the night, but light.
mm.
You are not like many others, but you will endure, and I show you the way.
Oh,
So,
beautiful
yeah,
poetics with the imagery.
yeah, I love and I do have a pattern, as you might imagine, of making cards about something coming through struggle. So
Mhm.
this is really that.
Okay.
Um, and these owls are really amazing creatures. They're incredibly they're beautiful, they're lethal. They're all these incredible things wrapped into one.
Mhm.
Um,
But
and
that
so
lethal, that
yeah.
designation does draws us back to life and death, that
Yes,
mortality and
absolutely.
survival are connected.
That's right. Yeah. And the owl is truly to me, it just sort of captures, yes, that life and death, and the struggle. Um, because they are they are predatory birds. And
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
but also the beauty of, I have pictures of owls with their babies, and they're just incredible animals, and their senses are so acute. And that's reminding me to hear and see.
Mm.
Um, and barn owls don't hoot. They kind of hiss and make weird sounds. They don't really make owl sounds. So I think I've also related to the animal because the not like it's not like the others kind of thing. It's not like the other
Independence,
owls.
unique.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it's really this incredible protective figure as these men are sort of striving and struggling to
Mhm.
get the boat upright or whatever they're doing.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
so, and then I forgot about that. There's also coins here, and I think that that's about the richness. It's not really about money. It's about the richness.
Richness of meaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Mhm. So there it's the deep awareness into it, as we as therapists would see, it's the shadow, the struggle at every level that humanity has to survive, but also the boating, the tipping, the threat of, my goodness, we could go into the depths of the ocean giving birth but swallowing us up. And then right there, the whole front of your SoulCollage is that powerful, beautiful, strong, radiant owl. And then touching on that, the gold of meaning and purpose, the gold, the wisdoms that you've cultivated over decades with those who have come to you. What is the second piece that you wanted to share?
So he comes from the world of sand. Um,
And for our viewers,
and
the world of sand, we're referring to all forms of sand therapy.
yes,
Yeah. Mm.
sand and figurines.
There we go. Hmm.
And he is, as you might see, a zebra. I guess it's a he. I mean, I don't know. I'll just say he. Um, Again, this goes back to my childhood in a way that I never, until I started these things started keeping, they appeared over and over in my cards, in my SoulCollage cards. And I'm like, well, you loved that carousel. And there's this incredible carousel in Ocean City. It's an antique. It's probably priceless by now. It's at the end of the boardwalk. And it's a hand carved carousel from the turn of the 20th century. It's beautiful. And it
Wow.
has a menagerie. It's very unusual in that it's not all horses.
Hmm.
So it has a menagerie. And when I was a kid and we went to Ocean City, I didn't care about any of the other animals except there was a zebra. I loved horses, but I wanted the zebra. And
Mm.
one of the reasons why was the zebra was the one equine creature with no saddle. He had no encumbrances,
Mm.
no bridle. Well, maybe he
Mm.
did have bridle, I can't remember, but
Mm.
he didn't have any, he was wild in a way. He had this wildness about him.
Mhm.
Um, I
Mm.
think as I worked with SoulCollage, and zebras are in several of my cards, is that I find black and white animals, and especially in a horse form, and
Mhm.
that's the zebra sort of is that, um, kind of symbolic of holding dual things, the black and white, and the black and white of things in one creature.
Mhm.
Um, and I think with zebras, their skin is black, I think, and the stripes are on top. So it's actually white on black. So
Mm.
anyway,
Mm.
but so they have appeared in my cards, one of which is a witness card, which is just about non-judgmental seeing, because
Mhm.
to me the animal holds duality.
Yes.
Um, and they've appeared in other cards, one of which was the zebra walking in the snow, because it's zebras don't walk through snow unless they're captive, but it's something about perseverance. Walking through snow,
Mm.
you have to strive and walk on. And then they appear again in another card where they're fighting. And one of the things that I found out later about zebras is that there were a lot of people back in the, I don't know, turn of the century, when rich people loved to keep menageries and stuff, and they liked, especially like American industrialists and people like that, they liked to keep these wild creatures around, and they would have zebras and they would hook them up to carts and things, but they found them really hard to tame. And the reason they're really hard to tame, well, they're wild, but the reason they're really hard to tame is they're used to running from lions. And they kick and they defend themselves and they're feisty.
Mm.
And so they're not like a domestic horse at all. So I was like, I admire this little horse-like critter who honks like a donkey and just kicks lions in the head, and just the
Mm.
incredible
Mm. Mm.
perseverance of this animal, and this sort of symbolism of its
Yeah.
stripes. Um,
Do you see these qualities in yourself as
well,
you have to?
I want to I think I've come to identify with them more, and seeing myself as persistent. I think there's a persistence.
Mm. Mhm.
And I don't know about wild, maybe a little wild. But the toughness, I I aspire to some of the, not a mean, well, they can be a
No.
little feisty, but not a mean toughness, but
No.
a persistence in them.
Roberta, if you
So
were to bring both the zebra and the owl together, um, as if there they are,
yeah,
and who do you imagine would start a conversation if they were to speak to each other? Roberta, do they know each other, do you think?
they might. Um, I think maybe the zebra might say, "Oh, I've had to fight so hard, you know, getting through all this stuff," um, and that the owl might say, "Well, let me turn it around a little bit." The owl might say, "Well, you can be in the shadows. You can be in a difficult situation, and you can still find wisdom, find your survival,
Mm-hmm.
find your heart." Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's, I guess, maybe the part of me that, yeah, wants to kick and bray.
Um,
Maybe the owl can help it calm down sometimes.
but they're almost a beautiful reflection of each other. The black and the white,
Right in the
the one
middle.
that's wild up in the rafters, and the other one that's wild on the ground. The determined kind of focus
Yeah.
that they both bring. Um, if they were to turn to us and give us a piece of wisdom about death and dying, about bereavement, about loss, what do you imagine they would say to us?
I think the zebra would say, know that you'll survive,
Mm.
and that you will survive. And at first, it will seem more like survival than thriving, but you will get to that. Um, the owl may say, I I'm here for you to protect you
Mm.
from the struggle and the darkness. I thrive in the darkness and I move through the darkness,
Mhm.
so I can show you how to move through the darkness.
Beautiful.
And yeah, so
Mm.
that, I guess that would be what I would say about them. And
And I'm
Jealousy.
imagining since you do this, they've already had conversations with you. The one of the things that you've helped illustrate that will be strange for many people is the power and the importance of giving voice to objects to help bring out meaning. That it is, again, this is not silly nonsense, but the power of this is how our brain works, and this is how we connect the brain to the emotion and to the grief and to the loss, and that power of giving voice, the owl and the qualities that zebra and owl bring and then give to you as well as forming almost a triangle of hope, not of dismissal, but of real
Right,
grounded presence to
right.
this is grief, this is death, this is loss, and this is who you are, and this is how we will move forward one step at a time. What have you learned over the decades that you've been working with not only supervisees, the clinicians and the interns, your clients, and maybe even community groups? What would you want to share with us? Maybe there was a moment or a session where you discovered it was a meaningful learning moment for you, Roberta.
Yeah, if I had to have it, sometimes it's hard to distill it down with clients, for example, because there's so many things you remember and circumstances you remember, and
Hmm.
um, sometimes extraordinarily difficult things. Um, and I think because grief and loss, for most of us, getting older, um, getting ill, or things that happen, my clients have taught me so much um, about survival with an enormous amount of grace. I think about one gentleman in particular I had some years ago, and he had a wife who died after 12 years of living with Alzheimer's. And he had made that promise, I'm never going to put you in a home. I'm
Hmm.
always going to take care of you.
Mm.
And he did. And she became bedbound and very dependent. He was, by that time, probably close when she was dying. He had reached 80 easily. He was having his own health issues. His
Mm.
kids were not super helpful because they had a lot of issues. So he said to me, I'll never forget, he said, I thought when she died that I would die. And what he meant by that was not that he wanted to die, not that um, he could, not so much that he couldn't live without her, but he thought the caring of her would kill him. So that when if he got to the end with her, he just wouldn't make it. And when I think of caregiving and how much people sacrifice, it's just enormous. So he's like, but Roberta, I lived. So now what do I do? And so here's this man in his early 80s, and he's got to figure it out. He's got to live life again in another way, because as we know, when people are caregivers for years, that becomes their entire world.
Yeah.
They become socially isolated. It's really hard to maintain a life when
Yeah.
you are a 24-hour caregiver. So I just and talk about the zebra. I just admired this man's tenacity to live. Man, he was this zebra.
Mm.
He was gonna kick and live and figure
Yeah.
it out somehow,
Hmm.
and how he was gonna go forward. And he just made such an impression on me.
Mm.
And you know, just trying to figure out, how do you make friends again when you're 82 years old and your knees are bad and you don't know where anybody is anymore. And so I just admired that tenacity in him
Mm.
and that willingness to try. That just really impressed me.
Hmm.
Um,
Powerful, strong,
yeah, yeah, really strong.
tenacity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Beautiful lesson.
yeah, yeah. So that he really made an impact on me. So, and I've seen that in many iterations with other clients, just
Mm.
how much they go through and how much and still they say, okay, now what am I going to do?
Yes.
What am
Yeah.
I,
Mhm.
what am I here for now?
Meaning
Mm-hmm.
we're back to
Yeah,
purpose and finding a way forward
yeah,
with support, not alone, and uh, the value, the essential value, it seems to me, of what you're saying is it's really important to get the support. It's really important to get the right kind of support. He had you, and then just that um, profound moments of finding determination and finding appreciation for what he could do to move forward.
yeah. And I think that that's just so powerful in this work.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Life-giving in this
yes,
work.
affirming. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So he's one that stands out in my mind.
Thank you. Thank you for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Um, there are limits and benefits to all educational programs. And in the beginning, we spoke about the dearth of real programs that would go to any depth at all, except for a paragraph here and there. If you could make a wish to change the education and training and nurturance of young clinicians, what recommendation would you want to make?
Wow. Well, I think that would be one that they would have a foundational class in death, dying, and bereavement. Um, and the way well, not necessarily young,
No,
um,
right.
counselors are when they're young in their career. Um, the programs have become more condensed so that they're trying to do more in less time to get
Mm,
hours, to get clinical hours with
sure,
practicum in 2 semesters.
exactly.
And it's really hard work for them. I don't know that that's going to shift. I think it's a permanent,
Mm,
the way it is sort of thing.
mhm,
But the pressure then to get clinical hours to
yeah,
meet that requirement, you have to have this number of clinical hours to get through this program, and
yeah,
then you have to sit for your test, and then.
yeah,
And if you don't sit for your test within a certain amount of time, like with counseling, um, you can't practice, you can't do anything.
right.
So there's a lot of pressure. And because in counseling, we got licensure relatively late compared to like social work,
Mhm.
we there were other ways we did things for a while. I was a CPC when I started. I wasn't an LCPC because there was no LCPC. And so, and then there was no LGPC for a long time. So we were able to do fellowships and things like that. But now it's in a way, it's more regulated, and that's good in a sense, but it makes things more, um, I think there's more pressure for
Yeah.
them to finish, get through the semesters, get it done, get the hours,
Mhm.
and so I I don't know that that's going to change,
Right.
but if I can hopefully help them to feel a little bit more sense of
Hmm.
space and the ability to exhale through that, and really, because sometimes you're so busy jumping through hoops, you don't see the forest through the trees. You're like, well,
Yeah.
this is the work. This is what
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
wanted to do all along. And I really hope that they don't get sort of soured through the pressure of the process.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I may not be able to change it, but what I can do is almost therapeutic in nature, I guess, and that's validate for them,
Mhm.
give them some space, help them to express their anxieties, um, talk about self-care.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
just a lot. School is a lot more than it was
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
what you have to do. You have to
Right.
do this within a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and I want them to know that I empathize with that and I validate that for them. And if there's a way I can help them just to feel like
Mhm.
they can breathe a little bit.
One of the principles that when I'm training therapists, is to lean into um, none of us can go to any depth with clients until we have gone to that depth ourselves, that to walk our own walk and to find those lived experiences, if you shared with us today, that were powerful, that were meaningful in whatever unique form that is, so that there isn't a door, a barrier to the client's grief and loss,
Yeah.
but rather that felt sense of, you understand me. That empathy that you speak about, Roberta, that, and the compassion, that the receptivity and openness to no grief is bad grief. No depth of the heartbreaking and the losses is out of place or should be judged. Um, and I think we both would agree that with the path that you've just described, there's very little time or permission to find meaning and purpose. And I love that you brought up self-care, that no matter one's licensure or population specialization, that to want and to be in touch with one's grief and losses and self-care and to find balance with that. Roberta, we're coming to a close, and I think there's so many more avenues that we
Mhm.
could that are
Oh,
so
I could
vital.
go on for a long
And we
time.
haven't touched on some really important pieces.
Mhm.
But as we close this session, I'd love to have you return, so we could maybe take a look at some more examples. Is there a wisdom? I think you brought a reading, but also along with that, is there a wisdom that you would like to share from your own heart to our viewers, to all of us?
Well, I thought about the sort of three big things that I really feel strongly about, and maybe I can talk about them with a unique perspective, and I won't take too
Please.
much time,
No,
hopefully.
please. Mhm.
But one is that we always, in American culture, we always say, well, everybody grieves differently. And we have to understand that statement in context because we are a highly individualistic society. So we value individual difference.
Mhm.
And not all cultures are quite like that.
Right.
So if we say everybody's grief is different, it's an incomplete statement for me because
Mhm.
there's two things
Mm.
about it. Well, if grief is universal, and everybody's grief is different, how can we hold both
Wow.
things? We can hold them. And I think for our clients, we have to work on that balance with them because if we continually say everybody's grief is different without the second part of the sentence, kind of, and
Mhm.
yet we all have a through line, then when they go to a group, for example,
Mm.
they're going to be the person that says, well, and this has happened, well, my situation is a little
Mm.
different.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
actually had
Mhm.
somebody do this one time, and her situation wasn't different, but she wasn't here. I mean, it was different. It was unique to her. It wasn't in terms of the circumstance. It was actually very similar to some other people's experience,
Mm.
but she hadn't heard it
Mm.
because she was busy
Mhm.
saying my grief is just mine and
Mhm.
nobody can possibly understand it.
Mm. Mm.
So I want to honor each person's individual experience, but also that there's a
Mm.
piece of this universality. Grief comes to everyone in everyone's life. And so how can we just hold those two realities, because
Mm.
grief is a lot about the both and both
Mhm.
happy, sad, all these things we feel at one time. Um, I guess the other thing I would say for professionals,
Mhm.
and it is we, meaning people that are doing a lot of grief work, while we totally acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Kubler-Ross about stages.
Stages, sure.
Our American public, your clients, will come to you and say things like, I haven't gone through the anger stage,
Mm.
or I haven't gotten to acceptance.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so we
Mm.
do have, I think we owe them the sort of psychoeducational piece about you don't have to be stuck in the box about it has to be a stage,
Right.
and then it has to be, it's like stair steps.
Yeah.
I've had so many people be so relieved when I said, grief is like waves,
Mm.
right? Or it
Mm.
goes back and forth like that dual
Mhm.
process.
Mhm.
It comes on you and then it
Mm.
kind of washes out, and people are like, yeah, that is how it
Feels
is.
better.
It
Mm.
feels so much better
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
them than I haven't gotten to that stage yet. And I know Dr. Kubler-Ross was not talking about those stages as a
Right.
sequence, and she was actually, initially at least, applying them to the dying.
Yeah.
And they're very valid feelings people have. Um, and yet it's important because I've actually heard therapists say, well, yeah, I know about grief and loss, about the stages. And I'm
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
well, we may have a little different understanding or a little
Lack of
expanded
preparation
understanding.
right there.
Yes.
Lack of depth of also how it's evolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I think it, unfortunately, our culture, our American culture is about problem solving. And so if
Yeah.
we see quote unquote a fix and
Mm.
we think, oh, well, if you do this, then you do that, then you get to
Mhm.
that part. And we're we're doing, I think, our clients a disservice, because what happens is they judge their grief then.
Yes.
They think
Yes.
it's a sequence. So it's like, well, then I didn't do this,
Yeah.
so I must be wrong,
Yeah.
or this isn't the way it's supposed to be. So we have to look at it how they sort of might interpret it. Um, the other thing, the final thing I'll say,
Mm.
and this comes from this incredible book, and I will give you the title of it, but it's one of the books that really changed my whole. I think your protege actually introduced me to this book because he mentioned it to
Oh,
me,
oh. Uh-huh.
And Tim
Uh-huh.
said, oh, there's this book called I Was. And I said, oh,
Mhm.
really? And I got the book, and it was so, oh gosh, it just said so much about death and dying. Stephen Jenkinson, the author, is this incredible
And we'll
storyteller.
put a link to that in the
Yes, and he's got a
description,
whole website and everything.
right? Hmm.
So, but what he talks about a lot with death and dying is our kind of the tyranny almost of hope, and that we get caught up in, and I think this comes out with bereavement counseling, in that we hear a lot of, well, gosh, I feel guilty that I didn't do more, whatever that is. I feel
Hmm.
guilty that we didn't talk about this, or I didn't know this. I didn't see that that person was dying,
Hmm.
because even with hospice, people will say often, well, I knew that he was really sick, or she was sick, or whoever, they were really ill.
Mm.
And yet I thought we had more time.
Mm.
And
Mm.
more time kind of leads into this idea of that there's hope or no hope. And so hospice are the people you go to when there's no hope. But
Mm.
hope isn't an either or. Hope is falsely dichotomized in our culture.
Hmm.
And so hope exists along a spectrum. So what I might hope for, I bring up age, I'm 64. What I hope for at 64 is not the same thing I hoped for when I was 24.
Right.
Even just in terms of longevity, I'm much closer to my immortality. I hope for different things in my life. For the person that's close to dying, they may actually hope to die. Maybe that they feel prepared and they're ready to exit the world. They may hope to get to some piece of their dying process that they haven't yet gotten to. Like, I hope my fill in the blank relative or friend comes to see me and we have a conversation. Many of our people have what I call, they've slipped out. So they've lost consciousness before they could do these things and have these conversations, because we typically think there'll be time for that.
Yeah.
And so we get into this sort of dichotomy. And so what Stephen Jenkinson, the author of this incredible book, says, more time for most people in that context means more time to live their dying. And more time to live your dying in our Western culture is not something people are even remotely prepared to do. So I wanted to read something. He's very iconoclastic in some ways, and he just changes your whole way of seeing things. So there's a paragraph he says.
All right.
There's so much I could say, but he is asking us to start developing a languaging around death and dying. And we don't have it yet, and he admits that we don't. So he says, we could start with a little word voodoo of our own. We could start making a language in which dying actually shows up and using it at every opportunity. This live like you were dying stuff is shite. Forgive me for saying so. This is how people who will die but are not dying talk. This is what they imagine is possible, and it is what they want for others. It comes directly from that adolescent caper that most have been in on. If you found out you had a week or a month to live, what would you do? Giddy excess is the almost universal reply. Dying people aren't usually physically capable of extravagant excess, and they aren't, quote, living like they're dying, end quote. Mostly they are dying and they don't know how. They don't have the words to say it. So we could work toward a day when you ask a dying person, so how are you doing? And the dying person says, I'm dying. How are you? Just as a start.
Very powerful wisdom for us to start integrating society, culture, therapy, and our lived experiences with each other. Roberta Rook, you have given us the gifts of wisdom and insight and some clarity about what we need to pay attention to in terms of working and being with others, ourselves, and the whole cultural frame of dying, loss, bereavement. I very much appreciate you spending time and sharing how your journey, how you came to this incredibly meaningful, maybe some of the most meaningful work that we could possibly do. And that is to be so present to death and dying, which is also being present deeply to life. Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you, Dr. G, and thank you for your skill, your consummate skill in interviewing compassionately and wisely. And I just am always impressed with how you
thank you
respond to and are able to just create that comfortable space to talk about all these things.
Thank you, Roberta. And if you'll hold on, I'll say a gentle goodbye, aloha. That the wisdom that Roberta has shared with us to take in and nest for yourself, to reflect on then, what is the meaning of your days that remain for you? How would you like to be more present with clients? And then that whole transference, co-transference, countertransference, that to really reflect on and relish and embrace the lived experience that's there. Take very good care, and I look forward to seeing you, metaphorically speaking, in our next interview of the person of the therapist. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.